Welcome to the Magnificast. I'm Dean, a Catholic PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, where I work on media and religion, and I avoid writing my dissertation.
I'm Matt. I'm a professor at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. I teach media studies, cultural studies, I don't know, some other stuff too. I can't think of a joke this week because I feel too beat down and tired from my everyday life. That's the joke.
Well, starting out high note this week.
Nah, that's all right. It's good.
Real hashtag Monday motivation over here. Well, quick side note before we get into anything. There's a really cool podcast called Revolutionary Left Radio, and this is a good way to boost your spirits, Matt, because I think this was really fun. You can find them at Rev Left Radio on Twitter, and you should all listen to it. It's really great. It's great all the time, but the host, Brett, invited us on to talk about Christianity and socialism this week, so it's especially great this time. The episode that dropped right before us is about the Zapatistas, so working through that catalog is really cool. Basically, if for some reason you can't get enough of us here, and we know that you can't, you can catch us over there. And shout out to Zach, by the way, who's a mutual listener of both of the podcasts, who connected us up and encouraged us to get together. That was very nice of him to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Rev Left Radio is my new favorite podcast. I was
very good.
Yeah, I was just listening to old episodes from my brother and me, and now I've switched to something that's a little more highbrow.
That's a pretty low bar, though, in terms of brow size.
Yeah, that's true. Go and listen to every episode of Revolutionary Left Radio. It's super good. They've always got good guests, and Brett is a good interviewer, for sure. What I really like, one of my favorite parts about every episode is the very beginning, and he just asks people what their political tendencies are, and that's super interesting. I love hearing about things people think and ways they align with their politics.
Yeah, it is really good.
Yeah, he asked Dean and I, and we were just I don't know. Communists.
Whoops.
Yeah, it was good. So listen to that. We'll retweet it and stuff when it comes out.
Yeah, he also has very adorable children at the very beginning, just telling you how great the podcast is, and that's a good touch. I wish that we had very adorable children capable of speaking. Someday when Lewis is old enough, we got to re-record this intro.
Yeah, that's right. Right now, I don't know, it wouldn't work out. He talks a lot, just, not very articulate still at this point.
Soon.
This week we're talking with Heath Carter. He's the author of the book Union Made, Working People and the Rise of Social Christianity in Chicago. It's a cool book that tells the story of how unions, minorities, and radicals challenged the established church and encouraged a pro-labor understanding of what it means to follow Jesus. Thanks to Oxford University Press, by the way, for sending us review copies. They sent us the nice hardback copies even. It's nice, good, sturdy book.
Quality book.
Yeah.
Books you don't want to move.
That's right. But before we get to that, we've got the usual podcast business to sort out. Here are some of those hot iTunes reviews right off the presses. They're burning my hands. They're so hot.
Hit me with some of them hot reviews, Matt.
Need to wear oven mitts. Okay.
Blow on them first, though. I don't want to get burned.
Okay. So the first review comes from username Arnuccio. This is, yeah.
We know him.
We know him. What up?
Shout out to Arnuccio.
All right, he gave us a 5 out of 5 star review, and the title of this review is just entitled "This." Okay. So this user writes, Dean and Matt do an excellent job of discussing the nuances and challenges of being a Christian leftist in our contemporary world. I cannot recommend their work highly enough. Me either. Thank you. That's good.
Something you guys have in common.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. All right. The next review is by username. Oh my gosh, this is the best username. Okay. Is by username LaCroix Osteen.
Are you sure that's not just you? This is another pseudonym of you?
No, I don't think so. This is just like this is just the dialectic embodied coming out in the best way. So LaCroix Osteen wrote a review entitled "Came for the Pizza Ghosts, Stayed for the Christian Leftism." 5 out of 5-star reviews. Yeah, that's good. All right. Okay, this user writes, I initially found this podcast researching quality resources on the intersections of pizza and ghosts. Yeah, our SEO is actually just that. Search pizza and ghosts in Google and our podcast comes up.
I think that's what we're doing wrong, actually.
Yeah, maybe. Matt is an expert in this field. That is true. Just 100%. The reflection on Christianity and leftist politics was a welcome surprise.
Can we just back up for a second? Like, I don't think people understand how much of an expert you are in this field. Like, I made a joke about that an episode or two ago, but for people that don't know, like, Matt takes pizza extremely seriously to the point of, like tossing that crust up in his own kitchen, swirling it around, experimenting with pizza, real pizza aficionado. And secondly, Matt has a real-life interest in ghost hunters. Like, he's written papers and presented them about ghosts and what ghost hunters do. So, like, yes, for real, though, expert on pizza ghosts.
And no one even laughed at me. Like, it was like a serious paper. I mean, they laughed because they were jokes, but they didn't laugh because it was, like, a weird thing. It's weird how little of that actually comes out in this podcast, but okay. Here we go. The user continues, Matt and Dean bring most welcome wit, reflection, and dope beats to the life of faith and action. Getting the notification that there's a new Magnificast episode is a highlight of my week. It's rare that people talk about the beats, but the beats are very good.
They're good beats. Like quality beats.
Quality beats, 10 out of 10.
We got the beats.
Oh my gosh. They're good beats. Okay. The next reviewer is username Ball State Freshman, I guess, from Ball State. What's up? What's up, Ball State? I think that's in Indiana. I'm not really sure, but, like...
I've never heard of the Ball State.
Well, it's like a college there, you know? In the Ball State, which is Indiana, because they got so many just, like, bouncy balls over there.
That was a dangerous qualification. Well done.
Yeah, I made sure to keep this family-friendly for the youth group.
PG, parental guidance required for this podcast.
That's right. Okay, they gave us 5 out of 5 stars. The title is Marry Me. Sorry.
Well, is it A-R-R-Y or E-R-R-Y?
Actually, M-A-R-Y, like the name.
Oh,
so
okay.
Maybe their name.
Very clever.
Yeah. You're right. Okay, so Ball State Freshman says, My partner and I are obsessed. We just listened to the latest episode on a road trip. As a leftist, agnostic Episcopalian, talk about qualifications, and liberation/political theology nerd, this is a podcast I wish I would have listened to early. Don't take it wrong, my partner suggests way too many podcasts for me to take them all seriously. Like smiley blushing face emoji. That's nice.
That's a good demographic, I feel like. Agnostic, Episcopalian, liberation, political theology, all the words are good words.
Yeah, for sure. It's good. Those are all good places to be. Episcopalianism's all right. I'm into that.
I got married in an Episcopal church.
Oh, yeah?
Yep. It was the same church where Betty Ford of Gerald Ford fame, tragically, was buried.
That's interesting. Did they make
something.
Did they make you pay extra for that?
No, I went there. So I'm Catholic now, but here's a little dark past, little skeleton in my closet. I wasn't always Catholic. So one time I went to the Episcopal church, and my partner and I, Emily, we got married there. She grew up Lutheran, and I grew up Catholic, and then we both went to this evangelical school. Didn't know what was going on, so we went to the Episcopal church as a happy little medium, I guess. It was nice.
Yeah. That is nice. It's like Episcopalianism is like Catholicism, but like not as serious.
Yeah, no popes. Though all of my family complained about how long it was, and they all grew up Catholic. So that's probably the comfort for me. It was just boring enough to be comfortable. The discomfort for them.
That's good. Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into it with Heath.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Matt, what have you been up to this week?
Again, still just like drowning in like classwork. I'm so busy. I'm teaching too many classes. I wish it would stop. I can't wait for the semester to be over. Besides that, I've been arguing with racist family members on Facebook. So just a real, just being a real activist over here. Really getting into it. Fighting the good fight. That's about it. I don't know. It's not been a great week so far. Dean, what have you been doing, man?
Nothing too exciting. I worked a bunch at the coffee shop this week, kind of unexpectedly, which isn't a bad thing. I actually really like where I work. My boss is very cool, and we roast coffee beans and everything, so it's the real deal. So I like that a lot. But besides that, nothing. Reading books. I read Heath's book this week, and that was too. Really fun. Good. I'm glad we both read it. That helps.
I know it's very good.
Heath, what have you been up to?
Yesterday is my busy teaching day. Teaching 2 classes right now. And then, before that, over the weekend, I was in Nashville, North Carolina, hanging out with some friends for one of my friends turned 40 over the weekend. So we went out and hiked in the mountains a little bit and hung out in the city where he teaches. So trying to just get back on my feet here. It's a normal week in the office. So trying to catch up with a weekend away.
Yeah, that sounds cool. Sounds like a good weekend for sure. All right. Well, where we usually start in these conversations, Heath, is just like, could you give us like an elevator pitch for what your book is about, so we can get all of our listeners on the same page? Just maybe like a little bit of a summary about what your book does and like why it is important to you.
Yeah, the book is about Christianity and labor in the Gilded Age, so the late 19th century, and it really emerged out of a paper that I wrote in graduate school where I was trying to. I had run across this article in my master's program where it was about a Wisconsin ministers union, and this was a fundamentalist newspaper, and I was like, okay, and the state of Wisconsin had prevented these ministers from forming a union. So it was an op-ed. I'm starting to read it. I'm anticipating the editor of the paper really going after the state, for stopping these ministers from forming a union. And instead, the editor of the paper was like, it served those ministers right for doing the devil's work. And after it's one of those things where you're going through the sources and you run across something like that, and it piqued my curiosity because I was like, well, how does that work? I mean, a lot of these evangelical churches, surely they have painters in them and they have blacksmiths, factory workers. What's going on? I mean, if you got your ministers, the clergy are opposed to unions, or how does that play? And so when I got to Notre Dame, I thought I would just try to test this little question of mine out, and wrote my first ever seminar paper in grad school on the Pullman Strike, and was really looking for any evidence of more than just whatever the ministers had to say about the strike. And I really lucked out. One of the main churches in Pullman during that strike, which is a huge strike in Chicago, kind of epic strike, not just for the city, but for the whole country. Lucked out in that one of the big churches that was in the neighborhood is still around. It's now a black church. It's founded as a Dutch Presbyterian church, Pullman Presbyterian. Now it's a black church on the south side of Chicago. And just rolled in there one day and asked the minister there if they still had the records from around the time of the strike. And he said, let me look. So he went into his file cabinet and just started pulling stuff out and pulled out this record book. And he's like, okay, here you go. First ever record book, 1882 to up to 1900, just sitting in a file cabinet in his office. And so I started looking through this thing, and sure enough, the pastor of that church had railed against the strike. And so I had expected that maybe there would have been some disruption. And sure enough, turn the pages of this minute book, 1894 left, 1894 left, 1894 left, and so that was kind of how this whole thing started. And I figured out there's more of a story here about the relationship between church and labor than maybe what people in the past have written about. Past accounts have often focused on what did ministers have to say about the unions. But I was really interested in if we're going to look at, how did the churches respond to the labor movement? taking the views of working people and lay people really seriously. And in doing that, found kind of a whole nother story. So that's sort of the way that the book is framed.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story, actually, the way that you tell it. And I like that historian's intuition, I guess, to figure out, surely this would have caused some kind of disruption. That's a really great idea. And maybe we could talk actually a little bit more about how you pulled this book together. Because as I was reading it, I mean, I'm not a historian at all. I have a master's in the history of philosophy, and it is not the same thing. What made you want to take this research on, apart from just intellectual curiosity? And maybe could you talk a little bit about something, I don't know, what was the most surprising part of it as you were putting it together?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I wrote that paper about Pullman, part of what I was struck by was that what did start off as a kind of just intellectual curiosity and trying to figure out a puzzle. As I was reading the sources and getting further and further into the research for this book, it was just I got swept up in it. I mean, it's just so fascinating to me. And, I was in my mid-20s probably when I started this book, and I, had never read stuff like this before. And I think, part of what I try to indicate in the introduction is how I really do believe that one of the distinctives of the first Gilded Age, some people say we live in a second Gilded Age, that one of the distinctives of the first is this kind of freewheeling debate and conversation among American Christians about the moral status of capitalism. And I think just stumbling upon that debate and finding this kind of rich trove of source material that was bringing all sorts of perspectives to bear on economic life that, I think are harder to find in the 21st century. And I started writing this book before even the Great Recession. And so, thinking about where are these voices, I think you're starting to see some more of them now. But, and I think that the thing that it was really developed around a series of conflicts. I mean, one of the things that's great about Chicago, I lived in Chicago when I wrote this book. Chicago has just got this amazing history in the late 19th century of labor conflict and also of religious innovation. And so it wasn't hard to find, every 10 years or so, the military is in the streets of Chicago trying to suppress working class revolts or uprisings. And, if it wasn't too hard, you start nosing around in those moments and you find a lot of chatter in church circles and a lot of debates. I mean, that was what was really interesting is that, people have picked up on what did the ministers say? What do they have to say? But finding the other side of that. I think one of the things that was most surprising, so one of the times when the military came home to Chicago was in 1877 during these kind of famous railroad riots that swept across the country, started on the East Coast, made their way to Chicago in July of 1877. And there's this kind of epic fight in what's now Pilsen on the near southwest side of Chicago, where the police and workers meet at the 16th Street Viaduct, and violent conflict erupts. The police are armed with guns. They fire into the crowd, empty their rifles, run away, reload, come back, fire into the crowd again. At the end of the day, dozens of workers are dead. No police have been even injured. That Sunday, in Protestant churches across the city, there's a kind of glorification of this violence and even a wishing that there were more workers had been killed because it would have served them right. That's what one of the Methodist pastors said. And, by the time I got to that part in the book, or the research for the book, I kind of expected that a minister might stand up on Sunday morning and say what this fellow at Ada Street Methodist had said, that, it would have been better if more workers had been killed, but would have taught those lawless beings the value of a human life. What I hadn't expected, and this was one of the big surprises, was that working people in that church cheered him on. The paper reported that there was a sensation that went through the crowd, and all but one person were just sort of rooting this guy on. And I started to look into the records of that church and figured out that a lot of these people are workers. And why are you, why are they cheering on someone who's calling for the blood of other workers? So, the story became more and more complicated. It started off in my mind as kind of labor versus capital. And as I went further and further into it, I realized that there's a lot of different layers to this. And in fact, I mean, ethnicity is a huge one. Skilled versus unskilled labor is a huge one. that the working class of our hoped-for imagination never really came together in Chicago in this period in the way that you might imagine it would have. That workers were not just fighting capital, but they were fighting one another. So, yeah, I don't know. That was one of a number of big kind of surprises in the course of my research.
Yeah, I remember reading the bit about the viaduct stuff in the book and just being horrified by some of the quotes that you pull out from those pastors. That was out of control. But one thing that really struck me too in the research and as you put it together is being attentive to different minority voices in the history of labor and Christianity. So two that I guess stuck out to me. One was this woman, Maria Darker Wincoop. So you quote her talking about wanting an overthrow of the credit system and, some pretty radical stuff. I liked that a lot. And then the second guy that stuck out was Reverend Bird Wilkinson, who was a black pastor who said Jesus preached communism, which I am all about. So is that attention the result of like just good, historical practice, scholarly research, or do you find in your research that the history just kind of made that easy for you to pick up?
Yeah. It wasn't easy, actually. No, I mean, I think finding it's the easiest voices to find are the ones that are best represented in the book, which are kind of the labor aristocrats, as historians call them. These folks who are kind of in the leadership of the early unions and whatnot. They're the voices that you're going to find most in evidence in the historical record. I was really thrilled to find Maria Wincoop. She was someone that I had. This is a woman, for those who haven't read the book, who. Kind of this remarkable woman who in the early 1870s somehow I never figured out how, she got a column in the Chicago Tribune where she wrote about labor issues. And it's pretty unusual for a woman to be writing, first of all, in the Tribune, which was really the businessman's paper. But she's writing a really kind of pro-labor perspective with a strong emphasis on, and in her columns, you really hear a kind of strong lament of the ways that the churches have abandoned ordinary people. So, finding her was a real, and then, you start to follow her. And once one of the things that's really fun about historical work is that it is kind of like detective work, and so once you find a little clue, you got to just chase every lead you can with that. So I was looking for Maria Wincoop everywhere. I found her family back in England and, just trying to turn up whatever you can, but it is definitely a lot of work to find someone like that. And Bird Wilkinson, I mean, I wish, Lucy Parsons, who's married to Albert Parsons, who's herself at least mixed race. I mean, it's really hard to find those voices in late 19th century Chicago, probably because there weren't very many African Americans in Chicago during these years. But also because, they're just not as well represented in the documentary record. I mean, they're just harder voices to find. I know one of the other kind of essays I wrote in graduate school was on the race riot of 1919, and really hard even at that later date to find manuscript sources on the African American experience of that riot. I've a friend of mine, Karen Johnson, who's at Wheaton College. She's got a book coming out on Catholic interracialism in Chicago, and she found amazingly this source on kind of a black doctor who has a child experience that riot. It's going to be a fabulous book, partly because she found that kind of stuff. It's really tough to find those kinds of sources. They're just not as easy to get to.
So on that point, I mean, the book is, it's a great history and a cool narrative for sure. What I like most about the book, though, is that it just has all these like really wild quotes from different people that you just like you literally don't hear anywhere. I don't know. In my undergrad, I took a class that was like on the history of like Christianity in America, and this is like all very new to me. So there's a quote though that's from Reverend Bird Wilkinson that is very good. I'm gonna read it because it's that good.
Go for it.
He says, Christ went further than socialism. He preached and practiced communism. And then Wilkinson insisted, there are no millionaires in heaven who have succeeded in stealing the fairer portions and renting them out, or in driving the poorer angels to the lower quarters. It's like some pretty radical stuff to say, and part of, I think, American Christianity that we don't pay attention to. Something that Dean and I were talking about a lot in this book, and like we were surprised about, is that there's no source book in the world that just collects Christian leftist stuff from the labor movement. It's just not anywhere to be found except in your book, which is, good for you. Corner that market.
Yeah.
But like, what were some of the characters in this research? Like, what were they doing in this research that really stuck out to you, or how did you track them down?
Yeah. Well, I think that's what's so, so that Bird Wilkinson quote, I mean, that reminds me a lot of this other exchange between this guy who wrote under the pen name Wheelbarrow. He was a knight of labor and a worker who got into a kind of incredible exchange with this guy, John Farwell. John Farwell was one of the big benefactors of Moody, kind of a really wealthy patron, captain of industry, robber baron type guy, and also a pretty sort of traditional evangelical Christian who's supporting revivalism and whatnot. And Farwell writes to the Knights of Labor periodical, which is one of the best read newspapers of the 1880s. He says, the Knights of Labor would benefit from reading, I think he says something like reading the four Gospels. And Wheelbarrow comes back at him, and they have this incredible exchange. They go back and forth. But Wheelbarrow's like, look, I think actually that the Knights of Labor have read the Gospels. It's Mr. Farwell that needs to pick up the Gospels. And if you picked up the Gospels, what you would know is that he is working hard every single day to find himself on the outside of the kingdom of heaven. Rich men will not make it. And Mr. Farwell is richer than any man who lived in Judea at the time of Christ. So who's in touch with the scriptures? That vein of working class belief and of a kind of sharp-edged working class retort to the complacent Christianity of the Gilded Age, where you've got these kind of gilded cathedrals and big downtown sanctuaries where all the wealthy are getting together and hearing from a very highly educated minister. One of the things that's so interesting in religious history circles, this guy David Swing, who shows up at a couple points in the book. Swing was a modernist, and he's often been used in our history books to talk about the rise of liberal Protestantism. He's brought up on a heresy trial in the 1870s in the Presbyterian Church. So when I came at this research for the first time, I thought, oh, surely someone like Swing's going to be on the side of labor. He's one of the liberals, right? Absolutely wrong. Part of what was so fascinating is that a lot of the so-called liberal Protestants, these modernists who are, bringing new interpretations of the Bible to bear, they are incredibly anti-labor, partly because someone like Swing, if you look at who's in the pews of his church, it's all the fabulously wealthy. And he's their kind of dog and pony show, really smart preacher man who, caters to their high-class tastes. And he does it in part he just goes after labor. So when Swing dies, shortly after the Pullman Strike in 1894, the Railway Times, Eugene Debs' publication, just rips into him and his $10,000 bathroom on Lakeshore Drive. And, if only Swing had actually preached the true message of Christianity. I just found everywhere I looked, I found that kind of vein of critique and a sense of, the Wilkinson passage that you read fits into a much broader kind of radical working class vision of who Jesus was. And a lot of the battles that I'm tracking here in the book are around the person of Jesus and what was Jesus about. And working class people are insisting that Jesus is at least a worker. And in the case of radicals, they're insisting he was a radical. I love the stuff on the Haymarket anarchists who, have often been, and they were in fact not themselves pious people, but they have a vision of Jesus as in some ways an inspiration for the work that they've done. And I love, August Spies, when he's going to be hung, says, I gotta go die like Christ died. And they see Christ in some sense as a model for their radical working class critique. So that's just everywhere in the documentary record. And it wasn't, at some level, once you start to realize that, you'll see it everywhere you go, everywhere you look.
Yeah, it's so wild and so heartening. Just knowing that there are people out there like that, there are people that are like that is, I don't know, I think a boon to contemporary leftist Christians for sure.
Yeah.
Well, one of the other things that really stuck out to Dean and I was the very beginning of the book where you're talking about Labor Sunday. We were just our minds were blown. We felt like it was just too good to be true that there was actually something like this that happened liturgically in a church somewhere. So you were talking about union members occupying the pulpit and in the preachers union. Could you tell us a little bit more about Labor Sunday and how cool that is?
Yeah. Yeah, Labor Sunday is how I start the book, and I think about it as labor's effort to evangelize the church. That in some sense, there's part of the story of my book is the story of how working people bring this critique that they see as not coming from the outside, but coming very much from the heart of the Christian tradition. And Labor Sunday emerged out of efforts on the part of the American Federation of Labor, which acknowledged that, of course, the churches, especially in 1910, when it really gets off the ground, the churches are an incredibly strategic place for labor to be kind of reaching out to, and they're important. They're not, they don't have votes in Congress, but they have an ability to sway many more people. And so, AFL reaches out to churches and starts to make inroads with particular church, really all across the different denominations. And for me, this is part of a story about how labor changes the church's minds about the union movement, that really for a generation, the churches resist a working class vision of labor and Christianity as kind of very much compatible. But by the early 20th century, because working people are threatening to leave the churches, they really get the attention of both Protestant and Catholic ministers, and church after church starts to issue these statements, pro-labor statements. And Labor Sunday is part of that story. It's a story about how the churches slowly make a space, literally on Sunday morning once a year, for working people to preach the gospel as they understand it. This is a tradition that still actually is around today. It's not nearly I don't think has quite nearly the pull or the sway that it did 100 years ago. But I know in Chicago, I did an event right around Labor Day with Interfaith Worker Justice, and they were in about 100 or so churches in Chicago. But I mean, one of the things that's really notable about that is they're not in a lot of the largest churches. They're not in a lot of the reach and their ability to get into particular religious contexts today is a lot more limited, I think.
Yeah. And after I read a little bit about Labor Sunday, I did Google it to see if anyone was still doing it, and there is a liturgy at the United Church of Christ for Labor Sunday. And I thought that was pretty interesting, but interesting, but at the same time unsurprising. I mean, the UCC being amongst the most liberal of mainline Protestant churches these days. So I don't know. Interesting.
Right. And I think in some ways that's an example of, part of what's so fascinating to me about our, the way that these Gilded Ages relate is how, in the book that I've written, I'm trying to show how in some ways a generation long working class movement yields kind of considerable institutional gains. Changing the church's mind at an official level. You get lots of statements. You get new church bodies looking at the problem of church and labor in a more sympathetic way. You get a Labor Sunday, et cetera, et cetera. And that's only going to grow as you head it toward the New Deal. By the time of the New Deal, Protestants and Catholics alike, you've got a lot of cases by that point where, Catholic bishops are getting on the stage alongside major union leaders and saying, our cause is the same. Protestant ministers in the Federal Council of Churches who, are casting Roosevelt's New Deal as the Sermon on the Mount realized in practical form. And so part of what's so interesting is that none of that is ever recanted. None of that's ever repealed. The church statements on labor are never, done away with. They're still on the books, 2017. But, we've got a situation today where, 70+% of Americans still identify as Christian, and you've got less than 7% of Americans in private sector unions. So, that's a kind of striking example of how, even though this stuff remains on the books, it's clearly not resonating at a deeper level the way that it once did.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. I was struck, especially in the book, by your trope of competing Christianities. That's the thing that you kind of bring up a lot. And actually, maybe this is a good way to get back to talk more about the Haymarket folks, who I think we should just spend more time on because they are so awesome and important. So one of the things that I found most interesting was that kind of tension between ministers and bishops, etc. The established church, they have an idea of who Jesus is, what he's about. And then there's also a witness to Christ outside of establishment Christianity, and that's understood by unions or radicals. So maybe I'll just like read a little thing from August Spies that you have in the book, and we could talk about that. So yeah, I pulled this out. He writes in a letter to his fiance before he is killed, saying, this is kind of long, but I think it's worth it. You'll remember the crucifixion of a young, bright, generous, and noble-hearted Jew by the name of Jesus. Hopefully she remembers, I guess. And in connection with this incident, you will likewise remember that a few days prior to his, quote, legal murder, he had entered the Temple of Jerusalem, where he found occupied the Board of Trademen of that city. And when the Jerusalem Board of Trademen saw their respectable business thus exposed by this, quote, foreign, half-distracted, wild-eyed, ranting agitator, and when they saw that his words were listened to eagerly by the people, they formed a conspiracy, drummed up some charges against the lawless fiend, and crucified him as a felon. You'll readily see the analogy of this in our own case. And then you go on to say that the clergy did not see that analogy at all. So can we like talk about that tension? Like, why is it that the clergy wouldn't have seen that kind of an analogy? And then also, you know, this seems like kind of a common strategy for labor to like pit Jesus against the way in which Christianity has defiled itself, or defiled Jesus in its establishment circles. What did that strategy do for like organizers and for churches?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think on the one hand, why don't the churches see that strategy? Or why don't they see that insight the way that someone like Spies does? I mean, I think really part of the story here is a story about the churches which had been in the earlier 19th century kind of grown as a result of the democratization. This is what Nathan Hatch has argued in my field, you know, that as Christianity becomes more popular and more kind of less elite, it grows in leaps and bounds. But by the time you get to the, 1870s, 1880s Chicago, there's kind of a calcification that's happened where, churches are really like social clubs, and in many ways they're functioning that way for wealthy Chicagoans. And so the kind of most prominent churches are full of the wealthy only. And Jane Addams, after the Pullman Strike, writes about this way in which, and we could again see probably parallels to our own moment, where conversation is happening in particular places and other voices are not getting in. The parlors of George Pullman's house were always open and hospitable to a certain class of person, but he's not hearing the concerns of others. I think, for people like the kind of Protestant elite that Spies is referencing here, they can't imagine. They just cannot imagine that Jesus is on the side of the unions. And it just didn't seem plausible to them. I genuinely think that it wasn't as though they knew that Jesus was and they chose to cast a different vision. I think they literally couldn't imagine it. I think working people, on the other hand, and again, I want to stress that there are cleavages within the working class, but to the extent that working people come to see Jesus as a model for their own movements, it's because they have this experience of being on the other side, right? And the experience of oppression, the experience of being among the lowly. I think that experience, both in the Christian tradition, but also in the history that I write. I mean, my sense is that churchly institutions are inherently conservative and slow to change, and that change always comes, almost always at least, from the grassroots, and it comes especially from people who have an experience of suffering and come to understand that experience through a Christian lens, and then and this is the key piece that gets to what you're talking about, Dean, that they don't just I think what they're able to do, what the workers in my book are able to do, and what other groups have been able to do, is say, we're not marginal to the tradition. Our experience isn't marginal to the tradition. Actually, our experience has opened up a window onto the very heart of the tradition, and we're going to fight you about that. And that's what the workers in my book do, is they say, we know what Christianity is, and we know the churches have abandoned it. And in fact, if they hadn't abandoned it, we would be in there with them. But they've abandoned it. And so Jesus Christ is with us outside the church. And the moral argument, that's kind of the structure of the moral argument that they're making, or the argument vis-a-vis the tradition, is that they own the tradition. Now, the churches and the leaders of the churches really don't give a hoot about that argument. For 40 years, they listen. They know that that's what the workers are saying, and they're rebuffing it and rebuffing it. And it's only when workers threaten to leave that they get the attention of church leaders, because suddenly church leaders are saying, we may not fully agree with these folks, but we're devastated at the very idea of a loss of cultural authority. And that's kind of the cynical piece of the story here, is it's not, at the end of the day, we might think that workers won the moral argument. The church leaders, it's unclear that across the board that was their sense. What they do win is a kind of they're very effective at organizing, and they organize in such a way and communicate a threat of, hey, we're out of here if you don't change your mind. And that's what gets traction.
It's just like, I don't know, sorry. It's just the tension between labor and Christianity is so, it's interesting and definitely very dynamic, but it just seems like Christianity, like the institution that is the church, I suppose, is just always a reactionary force in this story. And I don't know. It's hard to know what to do with that, because I still see that so much in my own experience and own life. So, I don't know. It still happens.
I think this is a relatively, I feel pretty confident in this, that it's not that the institutions of the church or the leaders of the church can never be agents of change, because they can. But I think if you were to look, and I think not just in American history, but I think if you look even more broadly, you'll find that they are much more rarely the agents of change. And people would say, well, maybe that's a good thing, in the sense that, part of what the churches needs to do is preserve a tradition that is in many ways good. But it can also be, it's a real struggle. And part of what's so fascinating to me about this too is even for a generation after Labor Sunday is founded, in the Methodist Church, this is so interesting to me. The Methodists are, imagine themselves as kind of like the founders of the social gospel. We're the people we're early adopters who accept it first. And yet, starting around the time that they issue this social creed, which is going to be taken up by the Federal Council of Churches, the Methodist Church finds itself in a labor dispute of its own with the workers in its own printing house. And the printers want a closed shop, a union shop, and the Methodists for 30 years resist and refuse them. And at every part of what's so interesting is you do get some folks on the inside, church leaders, ministers, who are very sympathetic to the workers. And Harry Ward was one of them, and he's an early leader in the Federal Council of Churches as well. And he's going to all these labor leaders and he's saying, I need you to tell me, how is the Methodist Church's hostile position toward the printers union affecting our outreach to working people? And he gets letters from major trade union leaders all over the country saying this thing. And he brings these letters to the General Conference in 1916 and says, look, this position we've taken on the open shop in our own printing house is hurting our evangelism of the working class across the country. And guess what? He's voted down. He's voted down because there are too many people in the General Conference who have, strong ties to a kind of corporate. So, that's the thing that is just ever present. And I think that was especially true with Protestants, kind of the ties to corporate leaders in the first Gilded Age. But by the mid 20th and certainly in the late 20th, early 21st century, it's as much an issue, if not more of an issue, for Catholics who move into the middle class and become wealthy. And you see in the latter half of the 20th century, and this is a huge development in the history of American Christianity, and especially as it relates to labor, is that Catholics who were, by the New Deal era at least, a pretty reliable, bulwark of pro-labor Christianity in this country, that's no longer the case. You've got really heated disputes within Catholicism, and a lot of folks who downplay the tradition, who say Rerum Novarum was for that period and not for the ages, and so that's a really serious obstacle for those who want to see a kind of revival of pro-labor Christianity in the United States. Protestants have always been tough on this front. Catholics, you would hope, and perhaps an influx of Latino Catholics, working class Latino Catholics, will will help to shift the balance here. But I'm not optimistic, to be honest. I mean, I think there's a lot of really powerful white middle-class Catholics in the suburbs who see this as not a Christian issue. So it's a tough situation.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because I'm Catholic, so I try to pay attention to what's going on these days. And it's weird because one interesting dynamic you pull out in the book is that even when there are ministers who seem to be on the side of labor, ultimately capital is what keeps your lights on. And if the workers are leaving your parishes or churches, it's natural to kind of court that wealth. And then unsurprisingly, class interests are kind of what dictate what goes on in your church. It's funny because in the Catholic Church, I mean, Pope Francis, more than any pope of recent memory, has been pretty vocally critical of capitalism, vocally supportive of people who are marginalized by economic exploitation, etc. He's on the record as saying that communists are pretty good. That's an amazing thing. I mean, the last two popes were arguably subtly and sometimes not so subtly pretty anti-communist in general. So the weird thing, though, is in a place like the United States, he's appointing some bishops, and they seem pretty interesting. But for the most part, it is those class interests that are going to be the biggest kind of threat to getting a vision from the magisterium, even when it is pro-labor on the ground, I guess. It was funny to read your book and kind of see that's the same sort of dynamic that's with at least the Catholic Church in the United States today. Like, I think you're right about that for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's true in the Catholic case. It's true in the Protestant case. I mean, I was at this Interfaith Worker Justice event over Labor Day weekend. One of the things that a number of folks in the room said, look, I'm a pastor at a really progressive mainline church, and, we can get really riled up about a lot of things, but we can't talk about labor.
Right.
And I think that there is a way in which this stuff, I think in higher ed, this is the case. When you start talking about labor, what you're talking about partly is money and sustainability, and people do not want to go this way. And I think that in some ways, this is one of the problems that the American left has had in the last generation is, how do we talk about and how do we fight for economic equality? I mean, that's sort of fallen out of the, and Bernie's trying to bring it back and whatnot, but I mean, it has not been a central focus of the American, mainstream, I guess, left at least in the last generation. And I think there are reasons for that, because I think there are really powerful folks who fashion themselves liberal or progressive in some ways, but who don't see a revival of the labor movement as a good thing, and who are not in favor of that. And so, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's tough to know. I mean, is there a revival of pro-labor Christianity of labor unions themselves in the book? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to fathom that at this point. I think we're in a pretty unpredictable moment, but there's a lot of work to be done on the ground. I get a lot of students here who come to my classes, and we read this kind of material, and they've never even imagined that Christianity had anything to say about inequality, that Christianity had anything to say about labor. This just seems the minimum wage. These all to them seem kind of under the realm of like, well, that's just economics, or that's just the market. That's not. What does that do? I don't understand what that has to do with my faith. I don't see those connections.
I teach at a Christian school, and they don't even think that here. Like, it's still beyond there. It's not within their cultural imaginations, I guess, at all.
Yeah, the American churches have done a better job, and I mean, we have a lot of issues, we see right now, and this is another thorny thing that we're probably, I don't have a lot of hope of working through in my lifetime, but I think at least race has been able to be cast in a theological lens, and is seen readily by many folks, not by everybody, but by many folks as a serious test of faithfulness. Kind of economic issues, class issues, labor issues. I think that it's a lot of work just to come up to the point where you can kind of get people to see, oh, this is related. I just think that there's just a lot of work that goes into that. And that is where it's really different than the period that my book is about, where you do have, I mean, not every single person, but everybody knows that there is a movement afoot making a strong case that Christianity is on the side of the working people, and that Christianity demands a kind of greater equality. I mean, that was I think would have been known even by people who weren't fully in the throes of those debates. People knew what was going on. I think now it's like we've kind of lost a sense of that.
Yeah, it's interesting because so many kind of liberal, progressive Christians that are out there doing good things on a variety of other fronts, whether it's race or LGBT issues or whatever, a lot of them seem kind of like naively okay with criticizing capitalism. But I can't think of a single kind of like emergent church author per se that comes like readily to mind that would also intentionally advocate like joining a union or being at a strike or like real tangible practical action. So they might recognize that capitalism as a system is bad, but they're like totally divorced from the ways in which people have historically found ways to gain and kind of win small victories against that. I don't know. There's a really interesting like inadvertent list of rhetorical strategies in your book for Christians on the left who were calling out like class collaborating churches, to put it a certain way. I was struck by that. Like you talk about scab ministers. That was a good term. I feel like should come back around. We should all be talking about scab ministers. Or like some pastors themselves talked about applied Christianity as a way of arguing for socialism, which is also a very fun kind of term. So reading the book, I was just also thinking of the way in which there are all these union songs, like IWW's appropriation of hymns, or songs about Jesus written by like Woody Guthrie or sung by Pete Seeger and Utah Phillips, like those kinds of folks. Do you think those rhetorical strategies? I mean, Christians are pretty good at entering into these symbolic imaginary worlds. Do you think those kinds of practices, songs, rhetorical strategies are able to appeal now, or do you think that labor and Christianity are just like so disciplined by capital that they don't connect as readily as they used to?
I think I haven't given up hope. I think that the hope is in those sorts of strategies that laying claim to the tradition and with practices and songs and whatnot. I mean, I think one of the big obstacles is there has been a very, very effective. And you were mentioning a moment ago, how many ministers or priests or whatnot do you know who will, just get up on Sunday morning and say like, join the union? I mean, you don't hear that a lot. And I think that is because there's been such an effective PR campaign against unions as such, so even if people can say, well, one thing I hear a lot of people say, back in that time, the time your book was about, unions were good, but now unions are bad. And you see that the most recent UAW attempt to organize a Nissan plant in Mississippi, where just an unbelievable PR campaign against the UAW in that situation. And that's where, and obviously this issue then intersects with other issues where, you get people in the churches will say, well, unions support candidates that I don't agree with on other issues or whatnot. And so that, these kind of wedge issues become again, a factor. I think that, if my reading, and I'm not the only one that's been writing about this stuff. I mean, there have been some other really, really important and good books that have come out in the last generation, last 10 years on labor and Christianity and other moments in time, the 30s, 40s, 50s. And you can see how at no time really was this coming. I don't know. There have been moments, I guess, maybe in the 30s is really the moment where you get a lot of institutional top energy into the labor movement from the church leaders. But most often, I mean, I think about Jared Roll's book, Spirit of Rebellion, which is about Pentecostal revivals in the Boot Heel of Missouri and how they brought, Pentecostal revivals send both white and black believers into the tenant farmers union. And, this is all, I mean, I edited a book with my friends Chris and Janine called The Pew and the Picket Line. And that book is full of local examples of kind of in particular places, in particular churches, particular communities, how somehow there was a vision that got cast that resonated deeply with the people and something happened there. I think that's still possible. I haven't given up on that possibility, and I do think that especially in the last 10 years, even since I started writing this book. We live in a time of possibility on these fronts, but there are gigantic obstacles. So, I mean, you hope that at a local level, if people latch on to these rhetorical strategies, they latch on to, particular kind of resources. I mean, that is the one thing that 21st century believers who want to fight for labor, fight for economic equality have working for them is they do have these resources and traditions that were established 100 years ago by the kind of workers that are in my book. Those folks had to kind of pioneer this thing, and now we've inherited these traditions, so we do have those resources to bring to bear. But I don't know. I think we'll see what happens. I trust that if a change is to come, it will start in places we've probably never heard of, among people we've never heard of, and catch fire there and hopefully spread.
Acquire the fire.
Acquire the fire. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's if anyone's listening and doesn't get that joke, that's a youth conference. It's not a very good one. What's up?
That's hilarious.
Okay.
That was a good, inspiring note to end on. Maybe there's good news. Yeah, sure. That's a good note.
That's the gospel after all. Maybe there's good news.
That's right.
That's hilarious. Thanks for reading the book. Cool. This is fun to talk to you guys about it. I'm glad you enjoyed the book. If there's more, if you're interested in this stuff, I mean, there is some really good work that's been done in the last few years on this stuff, and I'm working on this new book that's a little bit broader, but looking at kind of, trying to retell the whole picture of social Christianity as a tradition within American life of Christians who have seen the fight against inequality as essential to faith, not just like bonus points, but as kind of near the very heart of the tradition. So I'll be thinking about this stuff for a good 7 more years here. So if you want to talk more, I'd love to do it.
Yeah, we'll have you back for sure. Yeah, well, thanks for coming on, Heath. This was a blast. Super fun. The research is great. What you're doing out there is really important. Hopefully, I think more Christians ought to read it. So, go buy Heath's book. It is very good.
Yeah, it's called Union Made. It's on Oxford University Press. It is good. Go buy it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks a lot, man. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks for listening. Please go by and read Heath's book, Union Made. It's full of a bunch of great stuff that we couldn't get to, and Christians in America really need to get in touch with what labor history we have. There's both, more than you'd think, and also less than we need. So it's a pretty cool thing to read, I think. In the meantime, like us on Facebook, get at us on Twitter, drop us an iTunes review, tell your pastor about us, bring us to your youth group, help us get the word out. Also, go check out the latest episode of Revolutionary Left Radio at Rev Left Radio on Twitter. If you want to support us financially, especially because we put all these episodes together on top of our other jobs and lives, Matt's teaching 7 classes, and he has a kid, and he's married, and
it's too many, guys.
He's still doing it. He's still every week putting this thing together.
How am I gonna keep affording all this LaCroix that I drink?
Put that LaCroix on Matt's table. It's really important. If you want to support us financially, you can do so at patreon.com/themagnificast. A lot of other very cool people do. So if you want to be like them, you know how to do it. It's not that hard. You just got to buy your way in, like every other way of being cool. Lastly, we have a newsletter called The Magnifesto, which you can subscribe to at tinyletter.com/themagnificast. And there we collect some articles and book quotes and other stuff related to Christianity and the left. We do a little Christianity and Socialism 101 in each issue of it. So, I don't know. Think of it as your weekly read Christian devotional. Thanks again, Heath, for coming on. This was super fun. We're going to let the illogical spoon play us out, and we'll see you guys next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Besides, what else are you gonna do?